The 1920s was a decade of profound social changes. The most obvious sign of change were the rise of a consumer-oriented economy and of mass entertainment, which helped to bring about a revolution in morals and manners, such as the women's suffrage and the revolution of women's rights, or even the 1927 Murder Row New York Yankees. All of them had influence to what America is today. Think about that keyword influence and how it influences what society in America is today. The events of the 1920s can influence the government and its acts, laws, and rules of what it is today. Most of the significant changes that we've seen have come in and out of DC, but none as essential as what goes down in the Supreme Court. Things such as racism, the unfairness of immigration, and labor. I'm Sam Niffen, and you're watching Supreme Court Cases of the 1920s.
Yo, what's up? It's T Dollar from the streets of Chicago, and we're coming here to talk about the 1920s racism Supreme Court. Yeah. There was the abolishment of slavery, and once that happened, there was still African Americans treated as second-class citizens because of things like Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. But really, what you got to look at is until 1920, they were still being lynched. They were still being tormented by these white plantation owners from the past, and pretty much by anyone who was seen as a higher class citizen.
William Douglas III said famously in his rap song, "People telling me things don't change. This ain't our fate. We learned from our mistakes." And that's what American society did. These acts or cases changed the unfairness of white supremacy and started a movement or paving to a free and desegregated world.
Let me start you out with a basics of and what you need to know in order to understand the 1920s immigration and how unjust and how unfair it was made until they reviewed it and they made it so that people of all color could come into the U.S. soil. In the early 1900s, there was a large wave of immigrants. Millions and millions of people were coming from all over the place. And we could see in America that there was a high rate and there was a high increase of population, and they had to slow it down. So by doing this, they took the number of people that came in past years and they created a law by decreasing that number and letting that amount of people in. And well, the unfair thing about this all is that 0 Asians from Asian countries like China or Japan were allowed to come in the U.S. because 0 of them had come in from past years. Or people from Africa it was a small amount, maybe 100 a year, were allowed to come in because very few came in the time of past years. And well, the other racist part about it and the unfair part is that millions of white Europeans were allowed while people of color and minorities were not.
Another problem was the naturalization of immigrants such as Bhagat Singh Thind. A man from India was racially ineligible to become a naturalized citizen. So the case went to the Supreme Court and was then changed to anyone is eligible to become a U.S. citizen.
The case in 1924, Young Hook versus White. It was a landmark case because it ended a strict and a very strict immigration. Let me start that shit over. Okay. Young Fook versus White was a landmark case because it ended a strict immigration plan. This case made a looser and more forgiving for people of minorities coming from different countries other than Europe. And it was all because of the hard fighting, persisting Hyung Fook from China, an immigrant who was stopped at the border because he was not allowed in because of him being an Asian and immigrating from Asia. And he really shaped, with his kind acts and his selfless acts and his very heartwarming acts, something that a person really becomes a hero to people, really shaped the U.S. into what we have today.
Hi, I'm Pat, and I'm going to talk to you about the 1920s labor and how unjust and unfair that was.
Yeah.
Right. In 1921, a big mining accident happened, and 5,000 workers were injured in an explosion inside of the cave. Many of them were put into hospitals, but some of them were not given care. So that's why it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And so they appealed to the Supreme Court, and what happened is that all the workers got what they needed. They got all the medication, they got all the medical bills paid for because of the unjust and the bad treatment that was given to the workers. I want to talk about more of the unjust workers and how they were treated and why that might have sent them to the Supreme Court so often. Is because that that in 1920s there was a bunch of immigrants coming, and the world was roaring with this new technology and all of that, and money was coming quick. And other than the stock market, a lot of textile industries and a lot of factories were paying very low wages to immigrants coming, and then it created more of a mass production, and lots of children were brought into work. And I'll tell you a fun fact. If workers in a stitching factory got blood on the fabric, they would be punished or penalized by their wages. And it was already so little. Oh my God. A lot of the Supreme Court cases has shaped the United States economy into a higher minimum wage, like I think it's $8 or something like that, and it's giving people better working rights and creating unions for different companies, and I think we're on the right track thanks to the Supreme Court cases. Bye. This is Pat.